If you can share your cell phones are off or on silent, council members can share your microphones are turned on.
Is that the road record?
Second.
All right, awesome, thank you. All right, today's July 22nd, 2024. Today's a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council. Before we begin our regular legislative meeting, we do have some individual committee meetings this evening. There is a special street, sidewalk, and lighting committee this evening, so we're going to kick it off with them with Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I would like to call the Street, Sidewalk, and Lighting special meeting to order. Today is July 22nd, 2024. It is 6:03 p.m. All members of my committee are present, as well as the rest of council and guests noted on my sheet. Tonight, we have a special meeting to talk about requested legislation, a letter from Mike Tiadecki requesting legislation to enter into contract with GDP Group, Inc. for preliminary engineering for Worcester Road North at Hoppican Avenue Roundabout. Emergency wording requested. I kind of wanted to start out by kind of recapping why we're calling this special meeting. Council was of the consensus that this issue this legislation should have gone to the Planning Commission before it came to us. So we passed it on to Planning. Their next meeting was on July 17th. They discussed They discussed this. They did vote 4-1 to recommend that council approve money for the Worcester Road North and Hoppican Avenue Roundabout engineering services. So that's why we're calling this meeting. There's no emergency. There's no anything going on, but that's why we did this, because this is our last meeting before recess. Because normally Streets doesn't meet this evening. So we thought that the 60-day rule was going to run out. However, later on in this meeting, I'm going to invoke Council Rule 702 to suspend Rule 403, the time limit for legislation. So then we can call for this vote when we come back from recess on September 3rd. I do want to thank the citizens that called, each and every one of you, I'm sure, to voice their opinion on this. So I want to thank council for their work on that. I also want to thank council members that went to the Planning Commission, and I think you all asked questions and went there to see what was what. So thanks for going there, because I couldn't be there. I was on vacation. So I appreciate all of your work, as well as Lori for setting up this meeting. So I wanted to thank you guys for that. So firstly, I wanted to talk about Michael Tiadecki asked that we remove the emergency wording and call for 3 readings. As of right now, there's emergency wording and we wouldn't have 3 readings. So as a committee, are you all okay with removing that wording and also having 3 readings once we come back in September? Are there any thoughts on that from the committee?
That's up to you.
I don't see why not either.
I'm fine with it.
You know,
Yeah,
in this
that's
case, we
fine.
get to, because there have been a lot of questions, a lot of emails coming back and forth, and it gives people extra time to voice their opinions, and we gather information to bring back to our constituents. So I'm okay with that as well. So we can remove the wording, emergency wording, and have 3 readings. Can I have a motion for that?
So move.
So we have Kenny.
I'll second that.
Motion. Want to hear a second? And then can I have a vote?
Aye.
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 Okay. Aye. 3 readings. Okay. Then also, I would like to invoke Council Rule 702 to suspend Rule 403, time limit for legislation in committee. May I have a motion for that?
Chair.
Yes.
Real fast before, if anybody does that, I'd just like to, this is going to be extended to September 3rd only, right? Not indefinite?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, we will have to talk about it on September 3rd when we come back from break. So,
With that, so move.
I'll second.
second. Thank you. May I have a vote?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. So, with that, are there any more remarks on this topic only? What's the only thing we're allowed to talk about since it's a special meeting today?
Chair. I just want to, I think it's relevant to point out that it did go to the Planning Commission, and with the memo that was given by Mrs. Carr, that the Planning Commission did recommend that the City Council approve the project, was the findings of the Planning Commission. And really, that's the only thing that I wanted to point out.
Yes, yes. Okay. Anyone else?
No, I just encourage the citizens to contact their council person with their opinion.
Indeed, please do. Okay, may I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion. Oh,
Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Nope, sorry. You're good.
Second.
We are adjourned at 6:08.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, everyone.
I got 10 things going through my head here. All right, thank you, Ms. Beck. Now we're going to hop over to City Properties, Parks, and Recreation with Mr. Cheatham.
Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I'd like to bring the City Properties, Parks, and Recreation Committee to order. Today is July 22nd, 2024. Time now is 6:09 p.m. And all members of my committee are present, including myself as chair, Rebecca Gearhart, Jennifer Hagar, and Justin Greer, and all other council members and others noted on my sheet. We have one pending legislation, which is the approval of the lease agreement. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into a lease agreement with Historic Harold Powell LLC for the properties known as 459, 467 West Tusk Avenue and 94 Worcester Road North, commonly known as the Cox Powell Harold buildings, and declaring an emergency. Other than that, I have nothing else. Are there any comments from the committee?
Did we go over the updated draft and what was changed in that?
Not yet.
Okay,
I can do that too, I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Miscellaneous, for the ordinance, number 2024, the approval of the lease agreement, we did a redaction to that in section 3. It used to say in order to encumber the funds for this project in a timely manner. That was redacted, and it's now updated without that wording. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any comments from the body? Out there, gallery? If not, I'd like to call to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Gerhardt. Who's the second?
I'll second.
All righty. Thank you, Jennifer. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Cheatham. Next up is Public Welfare and Safety with Mr. Harris.
thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I'd like to bring the Public Welfare and Safety Committee to order. It is Monday, July 22nd, 2024. Time is now 6:11 p.m. All members of my committee are present, including myself as chair, Mr. Cheatham, Ms. Gerhart, Mr. Greer. All other council members and others are noted on my sheet. We have 0 requests for legislation, no pending legislation. Do I have anything from my committee? From the gallery? With nothing, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll second that.
We are adjourned at 6:11 p.m.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Rules, Marketing, and Development, Ms. Gerhart.
Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I'd like to bring the Rules, Marketing, and Development Committee to order. It's Monday, July 22nd, 2024, and the time is 6:11 p.m. We are in council chambers, and all members of my committee are present, including myself as chair, Mrs. Beck, Mr. Heidick, and President Greer. All other council members and others as noted on my sheet. We have no new requests for legislation at this time, and we have no pending legislation at this time either. Since we won't be meeting for the month of August and coming back in September, I'd like to continue the talk on the council rules, and I think we've all had a few months now under our belt to see how it runs and see if there's anything we want changes to or clarification on. And I encourage you guys, if you have any questions or thoughts on that, you could reach out to me. I'd appreciate it. Is there any miscellaneous discussion besides what I just said? From the gallery? Seeing none, can I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned at 6:13 PM.
Thank you, Ms. Gerhart.
You're welcome.
Next up is City Utilities with Mr. Griffin.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. President. City Utilities. I would like to call this meeting to order. Today is July 22nd. We are in council chambers. The time is 6:14. All members of my committee are present. Myself as chair, Jennifer Hager, Emily Beck, and Justin Greer, and all others noted. We have no requests for legislation for tonight, but we do have pending legislation. We have resolution number 65-2024 presented by Mrs. Beck and Mr. Griffin, titled OPWC Funding Application Elmwood Street Water Line Replacement Project, Stratford Street Water Line Replacement Project, East Side Water Line Replacement Project, Fairview Avenue to Macy Avenue, and the Concrete Roadway Replacement Project, Heatherwood and Shenandoah. A resolution authorizing the mayor of the city of Barberton to prepare and submit a funding application to the Ohio Public Works Commission, OPWC, for 4 infrastructure projects and declaring an emergency. Do I have any comments on it? On this latest discussion? None? Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Beck. Do you have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Jennifer. We are adjourned at 6:15. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Last but not least, Finance and Personnel with Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to bring the Finance and Personnel Committee to order. It is Monday, July 22nd, 2024, 6:15 PM here in council chambers. All members of the committee are present, which includes myself as chair, Mr. Heidick, Mr. Griffin, Mr. Greer. All other council members are also present, as well as guests as noted on my agenda sheet. I did not see Mr. Flaker today, so I don't believe we will be having a presentation of any finance report. For pending legislation, we have Ordinance 60-2024, Transfer Utilities Department. This would transfer $8,000 from the water fund to the general fund and declaring an emergency. Are there any remarks on this one? Next, we have ordinance number 61-2024, Appropriation Utilities Department. This is appropriating the $8,000 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the law department's operating budget of the general fund and declaring an emergency. Same thing. Next up, we have ordinance 63-2024, title Special Assessments, Demolitions, Lien Searches, Board Ups, Weed Grass Cuttings, Unpaid rental registrations, and unpaid utility services. Are there any remarks for that one? Okay, then we have ordinance 64-2024, title amending ordinance number 63-2021, employees not included in non-bargaining pay grades. This would amend the ordinance in order to increase the pay scale of part-time building official and part-time construction inspectors, and to add a plans examiner position, and declaring an emergency. Are there any remarks for this piece of legislation? Yes, Mrs. Gerhart.
I just wanted to thank Ms. Eisman and Mr. Shreve for answering all my questions. That's the end of my remark.
Perfect.
Okay.
Any other remarks for that? And I believe that is all that we have this evening, so I will open that up for miscellaneous discussion from my committee. Anything from the body? From the gallery for finance? All right. Hearing none, can I have a motion to adjourn, please?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you. And a second?
I'll second.
All right. We are adjourned at 6:18.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That concludes our individual committee meetings. Without any objections, I'd like to move right into the regular legislative meeting.
This isn't an objection. Can I ask a question about our special meeting? You said we'll resume talk on September 3rd for it, so that's where we'd have questions or anything like that for this.
For the streets committee?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
You can obviously throughout the break too as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that sounds good. I just wanted to double check it would be resumed on the 3rd. Thank you.
All right. All right, today is Monday, July 22nd, 2024. This is a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council. I call this meeting to order at 6:19 p.m. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation by Mrs. Thompson. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, we gather this evening asking for wisdom and guidance to make the best decisions for our community. We seek to serve with respect for all. Please keep our military and first responders safe. In Lord's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Present.
Mr. Heidick.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Silva. Here. Mr. Cheatham.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Yeah, here.
Mrs. Beck.
Here.
Ms. Gerhart.
Here.
Mr. Harris.
Here. Approval of the minutes. Approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Tuesday, July 8th, 2024. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting from Monday, July 8th, 2024.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Tuesday, July 8th, 2024. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Minutes are adopted. Acceptance of the finance report, is that right?
Yeah. He already gave it.
He did last week, I'm sorry. Acceptance of the finance report for the month of June 2024. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the acceptance of the finance report for the month of June 2024.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to approve.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mr. Heidick to approve or to accept the finance report for the month of June 2024 as presented. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right. The finance report is accepted. Petitions and claims.
We have none.
Matters requested.
They've all been dispersed.
Citizens addressing council. I did not check. Is there any citizens that would like to address council? All right. There are none. First reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 60-2024 presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Transfer Utilities Department. An ordinance transferring $8,000 from the water fund to the general fund and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Councilor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 60-2024.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 60-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 61-2024, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Appropriation Utilities Department. An ordinance appropriating $8,000 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the law department's operating budget of the general fund and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 61-2024.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 61-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 62-2024, presented by Mr. Cheatham. Title, Approval of Lease Agreement. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into a lease agreement with Historic Harold Powell LLC for the properties known as 459 through 467 West Tuscarawas Avenue and 94 Worcester Road North, commonly known as the Cox Powell Harold Buildings, and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Cheatham.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Ms. Gerhart?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mr. Cheatham's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Cheatham and seconded by Ms. Gerhart to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Bless you.
Bless you. Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Cheatham.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance 62-2024.
Thank you. And Ms. Gerhart?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mr. Cheatham's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Cheatham and seconded by Ms. Gerhart to adopt ordinance number 62-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 63-2024, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Special Assessments, Demolitions, Lien Searches, Board Ups, Weed Grass Cuttings, Unpaid Rental Registrations, and unpaid utility services. An ordinance authorizing the director, an ordinance authorizing and directing the Director of Finance to certify the Summit County Fiscal Office special assessments against certain properties located within the city for the cost of ordered demolitions, condemnation-related environmental assessments, abatement, lien searches, emergency board-ups, property cleanup, weed, grass cuttings, delinquent rental registration, and associated penalties and utility services that are 60 days past due during the time period of September 2023 through August 2024, and permitting the city to apply an assessment as described in the residential and commercial sidewalk program and declaring an emergency.
All right. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 63-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 63-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 64-2024, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, amending ordinance number 63-2021. Employees not included in non-bargaining pay grades. An ordinance amending ordinance 63-2021, employees not included in non-bargaining pay grades, in order to increase the pay scale of part-time building official and part-time construction inspectors, and to add a plans examiner position and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 64-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 64-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 65-2024, presented by Mrs. Beck and Mr. Griffin. Title, OPWC funding application, Elmwood Street Water Line Replacement Project, Stratford Street Water Line Replacement Project, East Side Water Line Replacement Project, Fairview Avenue to Macy Avenue, and the Concrete Roadway Replacement Project, Heatherwood and Shenandoah. A resolution authorizing the mayor of the city of Barberton to prepare and submit a funding application to the Ohio Public Works Commission, OPWC, for 4 infrastructure projects and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Beck's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance, or resolution number 65-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Beck's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt resolution number 65-2024. Are there any remarks? Please, clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
This ends the first readings.
Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Appointments.
To the Board of Zoning Appeals, Mr. David Sykes, for a term starting immediately and ending on December 31st, 2028.
Thank you. Is there a motion to appoint Mr. Sykes? Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to appoint Mr. David Sykes to the Board of Zoning Appeals for the term to start immediately and run through December 31st, 2028.
Thank you. And Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to appoint Mr. Sykes to the Board of Zoning and Building Appeals.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to appoint Mr. David Sykes to the Board of Zoning Appeals starting immediately through December 31st, 2028. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? All right. Mr. Sykes is appointed to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Miscellaneous and unfinished business. We really don't have any, so communication from the body. Anything from council members? Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since the planning committee didn't meet tonight, Director Carr, did you want to give any information from the meeting about the approval of parklets and outdoor seating?
Sure I can.
Okay.
So we've been working with Main Street, do I need to stand up then?
Ooh, official.
At our last planning commission meeting, we discussed parklets and outdoor seating for the downtown. We all know that it's a much needed thing that we're lacking down there. We've been working with Main Street Barberton, and we purchased 5 tables that are similar to what Cave has, and they're gonna go along Tusk Avenue in the bump outs, and they're gonna stay there all year. Our crews are gonna put them together and transport them and screw them into the ground once they come in, which would be probably the next 4 or 5 weeks. We'll have all of them shipped and delivered. And then parklets, Mr. Tiadecki and Melanie from Main Street have been working on 3 parklets that will temporarily take up 1 parking space in front of Block 7, M&M Tap House, and I believe Al's Corner Market. We're doing it just to gather some data to see if parklets are something that work in the city of Barberton, or if they're not going to work, or if they do work, what we could do better or change as people use them. They're not going to be owned or served by those restaurants. They're going to be for everybody that goes downtown, can go into the restaurant, come outside and have a seat and eat or just hang out. So those were also approved. We also discussed doing a blanket conditional use permit, temporary conditional use permit for outdoor seating for restaurants located along Tusk and 2nd Street. We've had several businesses come before us that want outdoor seating, but once they find out the conditional use permit is $300 and they have to go through a process, a lot of the restaurants that are starting up right now, they don't have the funds to just add maybe 1 or 2 bistro type seating chairs. So again, just on a temporary basis through the end of this year, to allow those restaurants to do trial and error to see if it works for their business. They will be allowed to serve there. Those are going to be their businesses. There is an application they will have to fill out. There's no fee associated with it, and they're going to have to name the city the city of Barberton on their insurance, just from a liability standpoint. But yeah, we're really excited about that, and it's something that I think downtown really needs. But if you guys have questions about it, feel free to call or ask. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hyde. Is there anything else from the body? Anything from department heads? All right, well, thank you for bearing with us on this day before recess. With that said, council will be on recess for the month of August. We do not have a 5th meeting this month, so our next meeting this month is not happening. And then through August, we'll be back September 3rd, the day after Labor Day. So I hope everybody enjoys their time off and the Labor Day Fest, because that's always a big fest before we come back, and it's been growing. So other than that, just be safe and continue to check your emails and phone while we're off. The mayor's not here. Is there somebody that wanted to speak on Mr. Shreve? Thank you. Sound like commissary?
Sorry he couldn't be here tonight. He was out of the office, but he did ask me to share some of this. So Friday night is the next Change for Change. It is at Ignite Brewery, and it is for Magic's Ready to Learn. We are still taking a collection of non-perishables for Christmas in July. That benefits Backham and Salvation Army. You can drop them off here at the YMCA or directly to Backham or the Salvation Army. He also wanted to remind everybody, as Justin had said, once we return from summer recess, we'll be in Labor Day, following by Mumfest, and everybody's looking forward to those events, and it's another great time for all of that. During recess, his door is always open. My door is always open. Come in if there's questions, if there's things that need discussed, stop on in. And then also wanted to thank you all for approving the Cox Powell legislation, and that really allows us to move forward and hopefully have something that's going to build up our downtown and continue to move it in the right direction. So with all of that being said, anybody have any questions? Yes, Rebecca?
Thank you.
Oh, imagine that.
Yeah, it's not really a question, just a reminder, we have our national night out while we're on break.
Oh, yes,
August
August
6th.
6th, 5 date.
Yes,
Yes. No,
it'll
thank
be
you.
another fun one.
Absolutely. All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Shreve. Before we go, I was just reminded also that council members and those members of the city too, on the 25th at Block 7.
At 5:30.
5:30, that's what the note says here. The pedal cart's going to be there, so if you guys want to go try it out, it'll be there 25th, Block 7, 5:30, and there's a pedal cart. So,
Square or be square.
with nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Heidick.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you. I'll second Mr. Heidick's motion to adjourn.
Thank you. A motion is made by Mr. Heidick and second.
I believe the pedal bike is based at Premium and not Blackstone.
It's based there, but they're presenting it to the public at 6:30. City officials can be there at 5:30 and have the first run.
At Block 7, it does say Block 7.
Block 7 parking lot?
Yep.
You mean? Yeah, the big parking lot. Okay.
It's expensive.
It was moved by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? This meeting is adjourned at 6:41.